Guys, Lockie from Focus Performance Training, and this week I want to talk about hips to ribs and how using this hips to ribs, principle or system or coaching cue, whatever you want to call it, can help prevent us from getting into some butt wink and losing tension in the bottom of our squat. All right, so what sort of spurred this topic on? Why am I talking about hips to ribs? Why am I diving back into this that seems to be done to death, our topic of butt wink? Well, because it's something that I've had to sort of work through myself, and this is coming from more of a personal experience and what I've learned through that experience. So I thought I'd share that with you guys. So I teamed up with Tom Hayes from Perform Motion X-Phys, who work out of Blow Parallel Barbell Club in Brisbane. And I've been seeing Tom on and off to try and sort out some niggles, injuries, and try and increase my performance and sort of make sure that reduce my likelihood of getting injured. And something I picked up after my last comp last year was that my knees were starting to really hurt and I was getting a bit of patella tendonitis. So Tom and I went through and started looking at ways that we can start to bulletproof my knees, make them a little bit healthier, and put them in a position where we can actually allow them to move quite a fair bit of load. And this sort of set us on this path where we realized that I was creating a lot of external rotation at my femur and my tibia was staying relatively stable, which was putting a lot of stress or torque on my knees, which would be transverse force through my knee. So tibia was staying stable while the femur was rotating out, which was causing a fair bit of tension through my knees, and that was causing some pain. So why was I doing this? Well, it's because I wasn't able to create the prerequisite stability and the right internal external rotation through that range of motion in my hip. So if you look at sort of an arc, and I'll throw like a little thing up on the screen here, when we go through any movement, we go through this sort of internal external rotation strategy. So we can use this going from a gait cycle or whatever you want to call it. But the first third of that movement is generally external rotation. The middle third is internal rotation, and then the last third is external rotation. So for me, I wasn't creating the appropriate external internal rotation or using that strategy appropriately. So I was defaulting to getting that external rotation and that rotation elsewhere in my body. And what this meant is that I wasn't able to keep my hips stable. And I wasn't able to set my hips appropriately under the bar or under my shoulders, which would mean that I'd have to find that motion elsewhere at the bottom of the squat, and my hips would tuck under. Now, I've got a few examples of this which I'll pop up while I'm talking so you can see what I'm talking about. Now, why is that a bad thing? Well, some people have talked that butt wink isn't that bad of a deal. It's okay in small bodyweight movements as long as there isn't load. It's on this scale, and I tend to agree with that. So long as we're not doing something under high load repetitively, we can sort of get away with it a little bit. But then my response to that is that if you're going to do something, we need to do it properly so that we can grain the right motor patterns moving forward. If you're doing the movements poorly from the get-go, then you're going to default to them when you're under stress and when you need to perform effectively. So my argument back to these, let's make sure that we're doing things correctly with no load under low stress situation, and we can shift our weight back and forth as we need to, so we can shift our center of mass appropriately depending on where we're loading the bar. Now, this will change based on what type of squat we're doing. So when you've got the bar on your back, your center of mass is moved a little bit behind you. All right, so we're going to have to shift our weight forward to counteract that. Versus a front squat, now the weight's shifted forward a little bit more, but we're still going to have to shift our weight back a bit to counteract that again. And that's going to mean we're going to have be a little bit easier to keep our hips under our shoulders or hips to ribs in a front squat. Now, even easier again, and this is why I've sort of never used it before, but the Zercher squat is a really good tool, I think, for allowing people to set up to keep their hips under their ribs, because it forces you to expand your thoracic cage posteriorly. It allows you to keep a good pelvic tuck so you can have a nice, strong cylinder. So you can imagine you're trying to keep that nice and stacked. If we're here or here, then we can't maintain pressure as well. So that's what we want to think about. And when we talk about the pelvis, the coaching cue or the sort of analogy I use is that your pelvis is almost a fishbowl, okay? And we want to try and keep that fishbowl relatively stable and level so that if it tilts forward, we're going to lose water forward. If it tilts too far back, we're going to lose water back. You want to try and keep that relatively stable the whole way down. And we want our shoulders to be stacked in that too. So it's moving in one motion all the way through and all the way back up. Now, there's going to be some smaller finite movements of the pelvis as we set, brace, and take load. But realistically, the big picture from my perspective is that we want to keep the hips under the ribs so that we can keep a nice strong stack. This then flows into how our diaphragm and pelvic floor contract reflexively. If we've got the diaphragm, which is on top here, which will pull down to increase the, it'll increase the pressure or increase the pressure in the lungs so the air will flow in so that we can create a greater or expand that cavity. This pushes down and we need the pelvic floor to come up to squeeze through so that we can create more pressure in our gut or in between sort of a 10th, 11th rib and our pelvis. If that pelvic floor doesn't come back up, we're just pushing down and our innominate bones or the bones of our pelvis will just simply push out to accommodate for this. And we won't be able to create anywhere near as much pressure, which means this position between sort of our xiphoid process and our pelvis hasn't got as much stability as it could. And now our lower back's in a little bit more or is more susceptible to flexion and extension and movement under load. So where does this all go? What am I trying to get at here? When we're squatting and when we're taking load on our body, we need to make sure that we can set our hips and our ribs appropriately so that we can move from there. So in here, this is what we call proximal, so closest to midline, all right? Distal, it would be my hand just here further away. It wasn't really on the screen, but you get the idea. If we can create proximal stability, then we're going to be allowed to have distal mobility. The analogy for that can be you wouldn't fire a cannon out of a canoe because your body knows that's going to be, well, pretty dumb. You're going to lose. You're probably going to tip the cannon over or blow yourself up or something stupid. It's dangerous. It's not going to work. So what would you fire a cannon out of? Well, fire out of a warship because a warship won't move in the water. When you fire a cannon, it'll stay pretty stable. So if we think about the cannon being our distal limbs or our appendages and the warship being our sort of our midline, the proximal or the axial skeleton, if we can create stability there, then everything we do distally or through our appendages is going to be able to create a fair bit of force and it's going to be effective. So this is where this sort of relationship between the shoulder, the thoracic spine, the pelvis, the scapula, all that sort of stuff is really vitally important for us to understand as coaches. And so that you as an athlete can have a basic understanding of what you need to do to create good movement. You don't need to understand the biomechanics. You don't need to understand the finite details as an athlete because your job is to execute. It's your coach's job to understand that, to put you in the constraints or to provide some cues maybe to get you thinking to move in the right way. I think Angus Bradley brought something up, constraints over cues. I think that's really appropriate, especially in the online coaching world where we can't give immediate feedback straight away. So we need to develop constraints or to put athletes in positions where they are forced to solve a problem in a certain way. And this is going to be the right thing to do so we can get the right adaptation. This comes back to the Zercher squat. I think the Zercher squat is a great way to constrain the movement of a squat, to really force or to make it optimal to have the hips under the ribs so you can stack nice and strong. And what's more, it also allows you to drive some thoracic expansion, some posterior expansion, and to drive some scapular protraction so that we can actually get our shoulders forward. And that position there is very similar to the position which you'd have for a front squat, like Darth Vader's got just here, right? So there's a big bang for buck there, and I think it can be quite useful to really reinforce good patterns, teach good bracing, and move forward from there. So this could be a good way to go through and have a look at it, analyze your video, see what your pelvis is doing in the bottom position. And if you think you're losing that position a little bit, might be time to go back and have a look at the drawing board. Thanks for watching, guys. If you've got any questions, hit me up, let me know, and we'll go from there.